Support for Juneteenth, a community conversation, is brought to you in part by the City of Maumee and by viewers like you. Thank you.
First of all, thank you everyone and welcome to this premiere Juneteenth celebration. My name is Charles Welch and I'll be your moderator for today. So, to our panelists, I would like you to, from right to left or left to right, whatever, introduce yourself briefly, starting with you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Iden. I'm the supervisor here at the Indoor Theater and a resident of Waterville.
Hi, my name is Carla Thomas. I am a social justice writer and a community advocate.
Hi, I'm Linda Lucas, and I am a resident here of Maumee, and I live in a house that was pre-Civil War.
Hello, my name is Sheila Howard. I am a reporter for The Blade. I'm originally from Detroit, and I now reside in Toledo.
I have to admit that I did not know about Juneteenth until much later in life, as I should have. Would any of you please explain when you found out about Juneteenth and how you found out?
I thought about that in regards to this event. My cousin told me about Juneteenth about 20 plus years ago, so I was in my 40s. I was excited to hear about it, but sad at the same time, wondering why I had just heard about it. And she explained what it was and how the slaves didn't know they were free. And as a 40-something-year-old person, I was kind of in shock as to why this particular part of history was omitted from the classrooms or even just from conversations, in the home.
Anyone else?
I personally don't think that I heard of it until it was being signed as a national holiday. I grew up in Ohio and in a predominantly white community, so it's not something that was included in our history books, not something that I'd heard of. And, like they said in the documentary, it kind of was taught that when the Emancipation Proclamation came to, slaves were free, and that was that. So it was kind of, world-shattering to think that there was additional time past that point where we still had people enslaved, and it wasn't just cut and dry that, okay, we're done with that.
Yep, I would have to say I didn't learn until later adulthood about Juneteenth, and it probably was when they made it a holiday. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I started out life as a school teacher, and I lived on the East Coast, and it was a very integrated community. I didn't know the term Juneteenth, but I remember in talking with the kids and learning that, teaching history, that we did learn that it took forever for the information to get to all of the states. What I didn't understand at that time was, and I thought it was really nice the way they said it in the documentary, is that we didn't have the newspapers, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have that, and basically the people that had enslaved others just let it happen. And so for 2 years, they knew these were no longer their people, and it just let it happen. And I remember just being really startled. So it wasn't until I moved here to the Ohio area that I learned the term Juneteenth.
That's interesting. But I think it's not interesting, but it's something to realize that many of us really just didn't know. We just didn't know. I'm sorry. Yes.
I want to add to what Linda said, because I think they said it in the movie as well. The narrative is pushed that it was because the news traveled slow, but in reality, I think it was because of oppression and greed and the desire to keep their slaves.
Now I'm curious, what parts of the documentary, to each of you, what part of the documentary stood out to you? What part of it kind of hit home? You're always going to be the first person to answer the question. Is that what we're going to do today?
Go for it.
Is that what we're doing today? No. What part of the documentary stood out to you?
I took notes, and one of the phrases said was, "Some things are so painful that we want to forget them. Slavery is one of them." And I think it might be human nature in a way to want to bury painful things, but when it's part of history, we learn and we grow from the truth, regardless of how painful it is. And I wrote an article a couple days ago about a Juneteenth celebration, and one of the comments under the article, I'll read it to you. It said, "The Civil War ended 160 years ago, and it's time to get over it and not keep rehashing it." Yeah. So I found that kind of painful. Painful that some people don't want to deal with the truth, and just sweep it under the rug. But even though it's painful, I think it's important that we, other cultures or other things that have happened in history, there's no issue with talking about it and dealing with it. But for some reason, this particular one, folks want to sweep it under the rug. So that's what stood out most to me.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say what stood out to me the most was when they drew the line through Galveston and showed how it divided, was it Browntown? Freedmanstown. And that's exactly what happened in Toledo when I-75 came through, and it went through the Junction community and the Door Quarter. And it's not recovered yet. And that was, I don't know, what is that, 60 years ago? So, or 50 years ago. But that just really struck me that it comes across to me as intentional, an intentional division, not, oh, this is the easiest way to make the highway. No, I think it was intentional all around the country.
Anyone else?
What stood out to me was when they talked about the wealth of America being built on unpaid slave labor, and then also when the troops came to let them know that they were free, it just made me think about, okay, they're in the field or wherever they are doing slave things, and someone is tapping them to tell them that they're free. And the way the movie was able to share and express why that's worthy of celebration, and then like Sheila mentioned, the comments that we find on social media under posts, I see them daily under the posts celebrating Juneteenth. It makes me wonder, why is it so easy for us to celebrate Cinco de Mayo or St. Patrick's Day, but not Juneteenth?
Yeah, I think what really stood out for me was, again, the amount of time and the gaps in how we're educated about, this portion of our history. We see the 2.5 years to have, the next point of freedom. And then we have people, like ourselves and like the woman in the documentary, that we aren't educated until later in our lives of, what happened, when it happened, who it happened to. And I think for me, it really stuck that this is a point of, okay, I know I now have the responsibility of teaching, sharing this information. Stories being told is how our history passes through generations, and when you know the stories, they're yours to tell now.
I think that I'm glad that the documentary didn't focus on Juneteenth and then everything was okay. That was just the beginning of, the struggle and everything like that. My question is, where do we, and from the audience as well, where do we start to educate each other, our children, like I said, each other and our children, about slavery? Where do we start to educate? Do we start in school? Do we start at home? Where do we start to educate?
Well, I thought it was in school, but clearly we haven't been taught our truest history. And to expect it to be taught at home, unless you were raised in a house where they talked about Juneteenth or any of the civil rights movement, you just don't have that educational piece because you are basically relying on in the school system. I would have thought the school system would have been a fair place for us to get an education. But now, speaking today in this time and space, I would say in your home. And if not in your home, then in a community gathering where, people are sharing the information.
Anyone else?
I think as parents, and grandparents, because it's important to be proactive in helping kids learn. And anybody who knows me out in the audience, I know they know that I tend to have a little wicked humor in me. And since my son is not here, I'll talk about him. But when he was in third grade, he had to do a book report. And he said, I need to do a book report on a famous American. So being I have a library background, I got him a book on Sacagawea and gave him that. And he read that and did a good report. And then he says, well, I need to do one about somebody that was in the military. Okay. So I gave him a book on Harriet Tubman. And he read that. And then he came back and he says, now we have to do one on a famous scientist. Are there any men out there that do that? And I thought, okay, I've gotten somewhere, because that was his question. Are there any famous men? And so sometimes it just takes pushing the envelope of learning about these other people. So grandparents, parents, and of course, there's always the library.
Always.
Yeah, I have a 5-year-old at home, so these are the types of questions I ask myself, navigating through the world today and in current events, and talking to my son about the things that we see and hear on television, on the radio, things that he may pick up from friends at school, and discussing, that sounds like a weird thing that was said. Let's talk more about that, and trying to find ways to meet him where he's at from an intellectual standpoint, and understanding the world around him is more than just him. So I think making those connections of where he's at and finding places like the library and in our community where we can talk with people who look, think, and act differently than ourselves.
I was struck by the slave Bible and the use of Christianity to keep people enslaved. Any thoughts or comments about that particular area of the documentary from anyone on the panel?
I'll just say that when I watched that, because I did do my homework and watched it before, that was the first time I had ever heard that. And so I was shocked that, because I know that over time I've often thought, okay, I'm a Christian and I believe in this whole community of everybody. How could people be oppressed like that and continue to believe? And so that was really eye-opening to me. But it also, even when and I thought the picture that of the blue-eyed Jesus was quite striking, that they said, this is part of we have to understand this is what we learned. And it is, what you learned is what you feels most comfortable. And so I can see that, but it just struck me that that I had no idea there was a black Bible or a slave Bible.
America is a fairly young nation. When you look at the grand scheme of things, America is a fairly young nation, and this was 1865. My grandfather, not my great-great-grandfather, my grandfather was born in 1906. And so just a few years after this. So thoughts from anyone on the panel, thoughts on the time line from then until now about it being so short or so long, or like I said, we're a fairly young nation. Thoughts on that?
My grandmother was born in 1898. And I had an older grandmother because she didn't have my dad until she was in her 40s. So when I saw 1898, when she told me she was born in 1898, you know, as a kid, you know, that was like, wow, 18? You know? And her grandmother was a slave. And one of my regrets is not sitting down with her, like with a tape recorder, to get some of the stories, you know, documented of what her grandmother and her mother shared with her. I truly regret that, but as a person in your 20s, you're not really thinking about that. But here and now, it does remind me of just, it really wasn't that long ago. If my grandmother had memories and her mother had memories, it wasn't that long ago.
It's interesting because whenever we have family reunions, we make sure that we get stories from everyone that we can get so that we don't forget. And I wanted my children to come today. I make sure I write down the lineage of our family history, just because, even if it's just on a piece of paper and we don't know the context of it, just so they can understand where we come from. When it comes to remembering things of that nature, does anyone on the panel have? Do you keep family history? Do you write down family history? Do you tell stories in your family about things about the past?
No, my mom was the only one that I know of who wrote our family story, and she wrote it in poetry form, but I don't have stories passed down.
We do. The grandmother that I was speaking of was on my father's side, but on my mother's side, it was my actual cousin that told me about Juneteenth. And she's kind of like our family historian. Now, she gathered stories from her mother and some aunts. Purposefully, she gathered stories. I want to say probably around the time she told me about Juneteenth, she was doing that. So she does have stories, and I'm not sure how they're documented, maybe just written on paper, but they do exist.
It's interesting because, and like I said, I write down our family history, and it's sad, but it's interesting that we can, in my personal family, I can trace it back to the slave master, and then it stops. You know, you can only go, and I remember writing it down. Well, the slave master's name was Williams, and that's it. That's as far as we can go. When Juneteenth became a holiday, there was apprehension from different parts of the country or different people or whatever about it. Any idea or any speculation on why just the apprehension about celebrating or acknowledging Juneteenth and just the freedom of slaves?
I think for probably a lot of white people, it's hard to confront that part of history, as, you know, people in our ancestry have a different attachment to that piece. You know, ancestors down the line of mine may have been slave owners, and it's hard to sit here in 2025 and acknowledge that may be a part of my ancestry, but it's something that we have to acknowledge. We have to see history for what truthfully happened, and I think it's important to acknowledge Juneteenth for what it is, and I think it's hard for people to see that one Independence Day is not an Independence Day for everybody.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think for those reasons, but as well for white and black people, we weren't raised celebrating Juneteenth the way we were raised celebrating the 4th of July, because it is a fairly new holiday. So we came out of the womb celebrating 4th of July, St. Patrick's Day. I was coloring leprechauns and clovers. Do I look Irish? You know, I mean, in school, it was just part of our history, like Easter and Christmas. So for one, it's going to take time. Forums like this help it. There was a lady sitting behind me, and she said, wow, I didn't realize, you know, this, I just learned a lot out of this, just watching the film. And so, and that's for black people and white people, because just because I'm black doesn't mean I'm in the habit or in the practice of celebrating Juneteenth. I'm still learning. I call it the re-education of me phase, because I'm still learning, because it wasn't included in our history books. And then I also think racism has something to do with it as well. So there's a good side and a bad side as to why it's not widely accepted.
I learned again about Juneteenth from church. My cousin was a pastor, and our church started celebrating it in Detroit. So my church has been celebrating Juneteenth for at least 20 years. I had no idea it was going to be a holiday, but folks were talking about or advocating for it becoming a holiday for many, many years. So I knew about it, and my church, we did celebrate Juneteenth. It was exciting when I heard that, you know, it become a national holiday.
Sometimes I think people have fear as a white woman, it's fear of the unknown, but I think some people are fearful because they anticipate they're going to get something taken away. And it's just like most anything else, nothing gets taken away. We just make the place better. So that analogy that they had in the movie where he talks about how America is like a home, and it has some bad plumbing, and it has some bad electrical, and it has a bad foundation, and we need to fix it, but we have to fix it together. So to me, I just really feel like that question is basically pushing it, saying, we've got to do this together, and we got to put aside our fear and say, let's do it.
What can you say to the people who are listening, who may be, people who are watching, who may be apprehensive or on the fence or totally against another national holiday? What can you say, message would you like to give to them to embrace the Juneteenth holiday and the history behind it?
I would say holidays are special times set aside to remember, to celebrate. And this particular holiday means, well, for me, just as much as any other. And I'm a storyteller by trade, and I would encourage people to tell the story of Juneteenth to their families, to their friends. I love forums like this. Tell people about the documentary, share it, ask other folks to, or encourage folks to watch the documentary we just watched, as well as this particular panel discussion.
I was just going to say that when you think about how to celebrate Juneteenth or any other holiday, it's a celebration, and it's celebrating humankind, and it's realizing that every little child that walks past you is one of God's creatures, and we should all be treated in a loving fashion.
I would ask the question, if you are opposed to celebrating Juneteenth, why? You know, what makes you opposed to it? Because it's a people, all of us in this room benefit off of unpaid labor, and if a people are celebrating a freedom, why can't we celebrate with them? So I would just ask you to ask yourself why, if you are opposed to it.
I would say if you're feeling apprehension, take the first step and learn and ask questions. I feel a lot of the folks that I talk to who say, I don't understand why this has to be a holiday, don't understand what it is or what it means. So take the first step and educate, ask questions, reach out to someone who does know, and then join in the celebration. That's
right. I wish we had a lot more time, because it's so interesting that when we sit down and we discuss how much we find that we have in common, how much that we find that we think alike, and we get answers, and we get resolution, and we get understanding. And so that's really a benefit of having you all here today. I think it was maybe James Baldwin, I believe, might have said, to be African American is to, I'm paraphrasing because I'm not sure, to be African American is to be African with no root or foundation in where you come from, but American without the benefits of being American. And so it's interesting that there's pushback about this national holiday, but like you said, we grew up celebrating everything else, but what's one more? I would like to thank everyone for your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them and your comments. Someone made a comment that we might have, there's more deleted information in our history books than there is information that can be told. Please give our panelists a round of applause, and thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Support for Juneteenth, a community conversation, is brought to you in part by the City of Maumee and by viewers like you. Thank you.